It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and John Daigle.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast, presented, of course, as always, by DraftKings. I'm Ross Tucker, former NFL offensive lineman, 5 teams, 7 years. Most of you know that. Love all these podcasts. Love them going to West Point for my one and only time this year. Air Force at Army, noon on Big CBS. Can't wait for that one. Love me some West Point. I also love, by the way, getting home by 7 o'clock after the game, which is nice. Maybe even earlier, the way those teams both run the ball. Looking forward to that. Looking forward to you guys checking out the Even Money Betting podcast, College Draft podcast, of course, the flagship Ross Tucker Football podcast, and my man, the cleanly shaven John Daigle. I already knew I loved John, but the fact that John shaved his beard because of his Halloween costume shows me that this is a man that is committed. This is a man that's all in to have a good time in life, for every venture in life. So you should follow him like I do, at NotJDaigle, and you should get a subscription to EstablishTheRun.com and use the code FEAST to get that discount. Anybody that's been listening or watching YouTube.com/Ross Tucker NFL knows that John is an absolute treasure trove of information. It has been fantastic. John, I think you look good, man. I like it.
A few years younger, yes, but ready to talk football still in my young age.
Love it. All right, let's start with the Thursday night game. It's the Texans, no Stephon Diggs, against the Jets, who somehow lost to the Patriots and are also somehow favored in this game.
And if you look at the advanced metrics behind the scenes, the Jets have actually fielded the league's worst defense in EPA per play allowed without Robert Saleh the last 3 games. That's the part of their team where they've just crumbled. They have yet to score 24 points in any game this year, and concerning for this one is that the Texans defense is quietly back at full strength. Number 2 cornerback Kamari Lassiter back in, as well as safety Jimmy Ward and middle linebacker Azeez Al-Shahir. So I think it could be another tough go for the Jets, who have at the very least condensed their targets now these last 2 weeks with Devontae Adams in the fold. Garrett Wilson and Adams now seeing 43% of the Jets' targets in that time. And although Breece Hall was previously being used as an every touch back, we saw Braylon Allen quietly handle more touches this past week against the Patriots. 12 carries and even got the goal line looks over Breece Hall. Maybe that was just because it was a short week, and so they had to reserve Hall for this one. I'm not panicking too much, but it's still something to take note whenever you want to start Breece Hall as an RB1. I will say for everyone out there, though, that if you look beyond this game, the Jets' next 7 contests are all against defense who've allowed a top 14 rate of points per game to opposing running backs. So Braylon Allen is at least someone I want to stash ahead of Thursday Night Football, just in case Hall were injured for the stretch run in the fantasy playoffs. And on the other side of the ball, you already talked about Stephon Diggs' absence, and it's really been a struggle to get anyone else there without Nico Collins, let alone both Collins and Diggs being out for this one. Xavier Hutchinson has been filling in as the team's wide receiver 2, but he has 4 catches in as many games in place of Nico. So the sleeper I'll look to, because what I think is really going to happen is CJ Stroud will still likely struggle as a QB1. I'm even open to streaming Jameis Winston, Justin Herbert, we'll get there, over CJ Stroud this week, if you can, in 1 quarterback leagues. Joe Mixon, though, I think is how this team is really going to function. Joe Mixon now in his 4 full games this year, over 100 rushing yards in all of them. And Tank Dell will still be out there for every route, so he's someone I'm still looking forward to starting in fantasy. But overall, I think the engine of Bobby Slowick's offense and the one who's ultimately going to get them there tonight, Thursday, is Joe Mixon.
So, just so I have this right, the Jets have fielded the worst defense in the league per EPA since Robert Saleh was fired?
The last 3 weeks, yeah.
Wow. That's wild. Okay, what about the Cowboys and the Falcons?
The Cowboys have clearly, everyone knows, struggled on offense the past 3 games. But what has happened, at least in the last 2 weeks, is that since no one has really stepped up to help out, running game also a struggle. They tried to get Dalvin Cook involved, just 6 carries for 12 yards in his first active appearance. Not only that, but we saw them have 14 days off, and on their first possession, they had a 3rd and 5, and they came out with a fullback dive to Hunter Lipke, whose career-long run is 6 yards. It's just an entire mess from the top down right now in Dallas. But we do know CeeDee Lamb is the one benefiting just because the defense has struggled so much and no one has stepped up behind him. 14 and 17 targets in CeeDee Lamb's last 2 games. So regardless of whether Rico Dowdle is out there trying to benefit in a 3-4 head committee, I think CeeDee Lamb and Jake Ferguson are the only 2 guys you're trusting for Dallas right now. And on the other side of the ball, it's interesting because Tyler Algier has stepped in the Falcons blowouts. So pending how you view this game script, I do think Algier can get double-digit touches. He handled 18 in Week 6 against the Panthers and 12 last week with a 2-score lead. And considering that the Cowboys have really struggled in their front 7, for as much as we always show up and talk about the Panthers defense being unable to stop the run, the Cowboys are mirroring them now with a league-high 154 rushing yards per game allowed. I think it's going to be a massive week for Bijan Robinson, even getting Tyler Algier involved. And unbeknownst to a lot of people, it's not just that Kyle Pitts popped up last week with 2 touchdowns. This is a full month now where Kyle Pitts has scored double-digit fantasy points at the tight end position as a top 12 option as well. So we continue starting Kyle Pitts with confidence moving forward.
Wow. Okay, that's good to know about Kyle Pitts. I didn't realize that. What about the Broncos and the Ravens? I'm telling you, the Ravens, their offense is electric. They just had some ridiculous drops on Sunday against Cleveland.
And everyone knows about the Rashad Bateman one where the sun was in his eyes. Can't even blame him for that big one. They also, speaking of drops, dropped 3 interceptions. That was a game where their offense was humming. Just a couple of mistakes that otherwise they don't usually make. So for the Ravens offense, I am treating Deontay Johnson after that big deal similar to how Amari Cooper and DeAndre Hopkins were eased in as veterans after their deal. More of a 30% snap player, someone I don't see getting involved too heavily in this one. And another reason I don't see him getting involved too heavily is because this is a nightmare spot for Bo Nix. I've already had questions at Establish the Run about where I rank Bo Nix this week since he has been playing better, producing top 12 quarterback numbers in 3 of his last 4 games. But remember, those 3 games where he was a top 12 option were at home and against the Raiders, Chargers, and Panthers defenses. Whereas this one against the Ravens front 7 and how Bo Nix scores his points and averaging 6.5 rushing points and getting there with his legs, that's not how you beat the Ravens. Even Jaden Daniels, and Josh Allen failed to rush for over 25 yards apiece against Baltimore. And if you just step back and say, okay, Bo Nix has to then beat them from a clean pocket or passing the ball because, again, that's how Jameis Winston beat them since the Ravens are continuing to struggle with coverages and blown assignments in the back end. Bo Nix is 29th in yards per attempt from a clean pocket this year. He hasn't been getting it done as a passer. So going on the road as a nearly 10-point road dog, I'm very worried about starting Bo Nix and the Broncos players in this game.
Okay, that makes sense. And you talked already about the Ravens. Before we get to the Bills, you know I love Labatt Blue Light, drinking it with my friends, family, living life to the power of we. Always enjoy responsibly. Beer, Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. John, what about the Dolphins? That's who the Bills are hosting. The Dolphins with Tua back in there.
And with Tua, this is a game that we can set our watch to because we've seen it so many times. In 8 career starts against Sean McDermott, Tua has a 7-10 TD to interception ratio with just 6.5 yards per attempt, 13 sacks taken, and 3 fumbles. McDermott has had Tua's number every time they've played. I will say who benefits still, regardless of whether Tua gets there in the end, and I do think he's closer to a super flex option, a QB2, it is Devon Achane. Because now in Tua's 3 starts this year, Achane has finished as the RB3, RB2, and RB2 for fantasy, averaging 20 touches and 137 yards per game. Raheem Mostert is still involved as their goal line back, but Achane handles everything else, including the pass-catching role. So he continues to be a top 5 running back rest of season. If your league mates don't view him as such just yet, now would be the time to go out there and trade for him. Looked very explosive as well this past game. And for the Bills offense, it's just a team that's humming along right now. The Dolphins have given up the fewest points per game to opposing quarterbacks in fantasy, but in his last 3 starts, Allen has completed 70% of his passes for 9 yards per attempt. Not only that, but 6 touchdowns, 1 pick, and 44 rushing yards in that time. Khalil Shakir has been the one who's benefited. As Allen continues to spread the wealth everywhere, Khalil Shakir from the slot has caught 36 of his last 38 targets, similar to an Amon-Ra St. Brown type of style, where they're just using him underneath and asking him to get yards after the catch. And after the Amari Cooper trade, oddly enough, it's Keon Coleman, who struggled to earn targets prior to the deal, but the last 2 weeks has now seen back-to-back games with a 21% target share. So it's a game where genuinely you can just start all your Bills because the Buffalo's offense is playing so well right now.
Ooh, I like hearing that. What about, this is the game I would have done for CBS. It's the 6th game for the CBS crew. My guys, Tom McCarthy, Jay Feely, but I'm on the college side instead. It's the Saints at the Panthers. Sounds like we might be getting Derek Carr back for the Saints, John?
And that's good news because the last 2 weeks, it's not just that they're allowing, as we mentioned earlier, a league high in rushing yards per game, a league high in points per game allowed to running backs. The Panthers are also falling apart in their secondary. The last 2 weeks, Marcus Mariota, if we take away quarterbacks' rushing yards and say, what if they scored exclusively through the air? Marcus Mariota scored 20 fantasy points exclusively through the air, and then Bo Nix last week, 29 fantasy points, just with his arm. Carolina is generating a league low pressure rate too. So although weekly we show up and are concerned about, 1, whoever's under center for New Orleans, but 2, what they can do under pressure since the Saints continue battling injuries in their trenches, I don't think this is a game where they have to worry about that. So I consider Carr a high floor option in his first game back. We saw Chris Olave pop back up in his first start without Rashid Shaheed for a team high 14 targets. So I am going right back to Chris Olave and Taysom Hill, because now we've seen Taysom Hill jammed 13 touches, including 1 pass, over his last 2 starts on just 45 snaps. He's clearly a player that they want to continue getting involved heavily, including inside the red zone. So in formats like Yahoo, Sleeper, where Taysom Hill qualifies as a tight end, I do think he's a low-end tight end 1 option, a viable starter this week. For the Panthers, it gets a little tricky because we don't know yet whether it's going to be Bryce Young and Andy Dalton, and obviously they just lost Deontay Johnson. We did see a start last week in an impossible spot against the Broncos where the Panthers did not have Deontay Johnson for their first time, and it was Xavier Legette, the first-round rookie, who led them in target share, even scored his receiving touchdown against Pat Surtain impressively, that one inside the 10-yard line. Behind him, though, it also gets interesting because they have an undrafted free agent named Jalen Coker, who did not get much run in the first month of the season, but honestly, the last 3 games, he's not only lapped Jonathan Mingo in 2 wide receiver sets, he's been awesome. Even this past week, leading the team in targets in his very first career start. So I think in place of Deontay Johnson rest of season for fantasy, we can go to Xavier Legette and Jalen Coker in that order, regardless of who's under center. And if Marshawn Lattimore is still struggling through his hamstring injury, we're not sure about his availability just yet, it's an interesting spot because quietly, the Saints have allowed over 8 yards per attempt on the 87 plays that Lattimore has been off the field this year. So a little bit of hope for their passing game in this spot too.
Jalen Coker's a Holy Cross kid. I did his game last year against Army. He's an athlete. I mean, he can jump. Body control and leaping ability are what I remember the most from him. That's interesting. All right, what about the Raiders against the Bengals? I don't know. What's the latest for T. Higgins as we record this on a Wednesday?
Day-to-day with a quad injury. I'm a little concerned because anytime Zach Taylor tells us day-to-day, we have to be a little skeptical. We have a history with him, elongate his injuries to the media. And it's also concerning because the Bengals have been an entirely different offense without T. Higgins this year. 6th in yards per play, 7th in the league when he's been out there, whereas in his 3 starts without him, they dropped to 25th in yards per play. He's been awesome this year. Although we have seen the fallout when he's not available, Mike Gesicki, the tight end, instead steps up as the team slot wide receiver. So if T. Higgins is out, you can still get away with starting Gesicki, who has 7 catches in his last 2 starts without T. Higgins. You can start him as a low-end tight end 1 option. For the Raiders, too, since the Bengals secondary has struggled, there is some life here because Brock Bowers has looked amazing. He's top 10 in receiving yards among all players, not just rookies or tight ends. But we have seen a bit of a change in the 3 games that Jacoby Myers has been out there for Las Vegas. In those 3 starts without Devontae Adams and with Myers and Bowers overlapping, it's actually Myers who's earned 31% of the team's targets to Brock Bowers' 21%. They seem to have a tight 2-headed pecking order that they like to go to, whether it's Gardner Minshew, who's going to start in this one, or Aiden O'Connell. So Jacoby Myers may be viewed out there as closer to a flex option. I think he's a wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 for fantasy instead.
Got it. That's interesting about Brock Bowers already being that good. And yeah, Gesicki, it seems like without T. Higgins, has been able to be pretty productive. Let's get to the Chargers and the Browns. There's a lot to talk about with the Browns now that they have a quarterback that will throw the ball down the field a little bit. And the Chargers actually have your value pick for the week presented by DraftKings. DraftKings, the crown is yours.
It's an amazing spot for the Chargers passing offense as a whole. Before their bye, averaging just 22.5 attempts per game. And maybe it's because Justin Herbert got healthy. Maybe because he's played so surgical that he forced Jim Harbaugh's hand. But regardless, in his last 3 starts out of the bye, 35 pass attempts per week. Not only that, but Cleveland's pass defense this week is in shambles. Denzel Ward unfortunately suffered the 6th concussion of his career this past game against the Ravens, and linebacker Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah went head-to-head with Derrick Henry in the 2nd level, got stretchered off with a neck injury. Without Denzel Ward this year, the Browns have allowed 8.8 yards per attempt through the air. And so my value pick this week is Ladd McConkey. It's not just that the Browns are struggling with injuries in their secondary that should allow Herbert and McConkey to get there, but the Browns lead the league in man coverage. And McConkey this year, not just your ordinary slot receiver. He's seen 31% of his targets against man coverage for 19.5 yards per catch and 2 touchdowns. I think McConkey dominates on DraftKings this week as my value selection.
Ooh, love it. Anything else on the Chargers side?
Lots of it, because if we do not have Hayden Hurst in this game as well, we've seen the last 3 weeks that Will Dissly has been targeted at the 3rd highest rate on his routes. Dissly has looked awesome in place of Hurst, so much that I wonder even when Hurst comes back from his groin injury, if they just leave Will Dissly as their starter. And with the Browns dealing with that many injuries, I mentioned the 8.8 yards per attempt, but also 28th in EPA per drop back again, if you want to look at the advanced metrics behind the scenes. I think it's just going to be a really great day for Justin Herbert and the team's passing game. So much so that where you have the option, I prefer Herbert to Jameis Winston in a vacuum off the waiver wire. But I do want to get to Jameis Winston and this passing offense because, yes, you alluded to it. They showed life last week. Finally being able to get downfield, although I do want to step back and say, as you covered the game even, it was still the full Jameis Winston experience. We talked earlier how Baltimore was charged with 3 dropped interceptions. There was a strip sack in the first quarter too, and Winston left some throws out there, but also It was the best spot possible for his first start, considering that both Marlon Humphrey and first-round cornerback Nate Wiggins got ruled out on Saturday. That Baltimore secondary is also one that far too often this year we talked about. Blown coverages, missed assignments. It's just a great spot for opposing quarterbacks. Whereas I don't think the Chargers are the same matchup. Jameis Winston's still fine, offering a high floor for fantasy football. But the Chargers, kind of like how we know what the Browns are going to do on defense, the Chargers have played the second highest rate of zone coverage, over 80% of their defensive snaps this year coming from zone coverage. And zone is something Winston has really struggled with his career and this season. 27th out of 28 quarterbacks in completion rates. Only Anthony Richardson has a worse completion rate against zone coverage. And even when you step back and just think about in football terms, not just fantasy, that makes sense considering Jameis Winston is a gunslinger who instead throws his guys open, doesn't really diagnose the windows to throw into. So I am a little worried in this spot for fantasy for Jameis Winston, although high floors for all the receivers he's giving life to. Cedric Tillman now. We saw last week 2 touchdowns, 99 receiving yards, back-to-back games with at least 21% of the team's targets. Elijah Moore, since Jameis Winston came in the fourth quarter 2 weeks ago, has led the team with 13 targets. Even Jerry Jeudy getting involved now as a wide receiver 4, thinner flex option. So still like all the receivers for Cleveland, but I do want to temper everyone's expectations and say step back a little bit because it's a much tougher spot.
Let's talk about my friends from Smirnoff, the world's #1 vodka and an official vodka partner of the NFL. I love this. Smirnoff is giving fans in select areas of the country, like maybe where you live, a chance to win the ultimate game day experience, from tickets to sideline passes and much more. All you have to do is go to gamedays.com until November 15th to enter for your chance to win. Smirnoff, we do game days. Please drink responsibly. Smirnoff #21 vodka, distilled from grain, 40% alcohol by volume. The Smirnoff Company, New York, New York. Please do not share with anyone under legal drinking age. No purchase necessary, 21 plus, ends 11/15/24. See rules at website for participating area and other important details. Sponsored by Diageo Americas Incorporated, New York, New York. We do GameDays.com. Last game here for episode 1. It's the Commanders and the Giants. Curious to get your thoughts on this one.
Daniel Jones now, in the last 2 games, has been under pressure on 50% of his dropbacks without left tackle Andrew Thomas. This is a nightmare situation because Dan Quinn and Washington's defense have figured something out. Over the last month, they're creating pressure at the 3rd highest rate. They've not just been that defense we walked on in fantasy that first month of the season. They've actually clicked and found something. And that's concerning since Daniel Jones has averaged just 4.5 yards per attempt under pressure this year. We even saw it against the Steelers. He's already been named, Dimes has, the starter for this game. But in those last 2 possessions, whenever you cause an intercept or a strip sack and then the game-clinching interception for the Steelers, it's a nightmare scenario that I think we see Drew Lock thrown in this game, if not starting, by week 10. So very wary of the Giants' passing game. Having said that, the last time these 2 teams played, although, again, the Commanders are a different defense, rookie Malik Neighbors did have season highs in 18 targets and 127 receiving yards. Not only that, but he's averaged 13 targets over his last 5 games. So I think the floor, at the very least, is still too high for Malik Neighbors to fail, someone we can still have confidence in. And we've talked about Tyrone Tracy on this show many times because he looks so explosive, even with this just being the second year he's playing running back for his entire career. But he did suffer a concussion at the end of that Monday Night Football game, so we're just unsure if he's going to be out there since it's a short week. And if not, we expect Devin Singletary to step right in as he did the first month of the year as an every touchback. Feel free to go out on waiver wires and pick up Singletary and just start him as a volume-based RB2 if Tracy continues trending towards being out. For Jaden Daniels, yes, 50 rushing yards last week, but still continuing to get there as a pocket passer. 70 yards and a touchdown, of course, came on the Hail Mary, the Hail Maryland, whatever we're calling it. Just a a beautiful play where Noah Brown was waiting, like the proper way to play a Hail Mary. But it's the fact that we still know where he's going to go. Terry McLaurin now, from weeks 3 through 8, has been fantasy football's wide receiver 3. And the Giants just benched number 1 cornerbacks Deonte Banks, expecting another massive week for Terry McLaurin in this spot. Also, Noah Brown, a majority of his production on that Hail Mary, but still for 12, 14-team league options, if you're desperate for a bye week filler or perhaps you have so many injuries to pad for, Noah Brown still saw a season-high 80% route participation this past game. So someone that I'm also thinking of sticking out there. And Zach Ertz, 3 consecutive starts as a top 12 tight end. Won't get you that ceiling since he's more of a catch-and-fall kind of guy, but just providing that low-end volume is someone I'm certainly excited about starting with Jaden Daniels this week.
Love it. It's going to be a fantastic week. So remember, this is the show that's so nice we do it twice. Still have 7 games to get to on episode 2, which drops shortly after midnight on a Thursday night, including Patriots, Titans, Bears, Cardinals, Eagles, Jags, Lions, Packers, a juicy one, Rams, Seahawks, Colts, a lot to talk about there with the Vikings, and Bucks, Chiefs. Make sure you check out John on social media at @NotJDaigle. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. We are at Ross Tucker Pod. A lot of people like to watch the show on YouTube, which is great. YouTube.com/Ross Tucker NFL. And if you haven't used the code FEAST at EstablishTheRun.com yet, what are you waiting for? I'm stuffed. We're done.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.